Something major just happened. In Washington, the government shutdown has reached a breaking point. Federal workers, unions, and even major banks are publicly calling on Democrats to end the standoff. At the same time, in New York, a leading progressive candidate has seen his campaign collapse after being caught in a controversy that stunned even his own party. Within hours, support shifted, allies turned silent, and voters began asking questions no one in the Democratic leadership seems ready to answer. The pressure is mounting from every direction, and the fallout is only beginning. Let's go through exactly what happened, who's involved, and what this could mean for the political landscape moving forward. Let's start with where one of these implosions began, New York City. Now, if you've been following the mayoral race there, you probably heard about a candidate named Zohran Mamdani. He's a young progressive Democrat, part of that new wave of ultra-left politicians who've been gaining ground in deep blue cities. For weeks, polls showed him cruising toward victory with what looked like an insurmountable lead, somewhere between 15 and 25 points ahead of his closest competitor. Then, during a campaign event, he decided to tell a deeply personal story about September 11th. He spoke emotionally about his aunt, describing how she stopped taking the subway after the attacks because she didn't feel safe wearing her hijab. The implication was clear. The real victims of that terrible day weren't just the thousands who died or the families who lost loved ones, but Muslims who faced discrimination afterward. Now, whether you agree with that framing or not, there was one glaring problem. The story wasn't true. Within hours, people on social media started digging. They found that Mamdani's only actual aunt, a woman named Masuma Mamdani, lived in Tanzania during September 11th. She wasn't in New York. She wasn't riding the subway. She wasn't experiencing what he described because she wasn't even in the country. When confronted, Mamdani tried to backtrack. He claimed he was actually talking about Zurafui, his father's cousin, not his aunt, though that distinction seemed awfully convenient. But even that revised story fell apart under scrutiny because, guess what, she also lived in Tanzania at the time. So here's a candidate running for mayor of one of the most important cities in America, and he got caught fabricating an emotional story about one of the most sacred and painful days in modern American history. Think about that for a moment. We live in an era where everything is recorded, where fact-checkers can verify details in minutes, where social media investigators can uncover inconsistencies faster than any campaign can spin them. And yet, he thought he could get away with it. But here's where it gets even more interesting. When people called him out, he didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the dishonesty. Instead, he accused everyone who questioned him of Islamophobia. He tried to turn his own credibility problem into evidence of bigotry against him. That strategy might have worked 5 or 10 years ago, but not anymore. Because something fundamental has shifted. People are exhausted by narratives that don't match reality. They're tired of being told that asking questions makes them bad people. And when a politician gets caught in a lie and responds by attacking anyone who noticed, it doesn't create sympathy, it creates backlash. And boy, did the backlash come. Andrew Cuomo, the former governor, who resigned in disgrace and is now running as an independent in this very race, absolutely dismantled Mamdani in their last debate. And I mean dismantled. He didn't just criticize policy differences. He went after Mamdani's entire record, his qualifications, his character. Cuomo pointed out that Mamdani had never held a real job outside of politics, that he'd accomplished virtually nothing during his time in the state assembly, that he had one of the worst attendance records while simultaneously voting to give himself one of the largest pay raises in the country, going from around $110,000 to somewhere in the range of $135,000 to $145,000. You've never run anything, Cuomo said. You don't know how to manage a government. You don't know how to handle an emergency. And you've literally never proposed a bill on anything you're not campaigning on. Shame on you. Now, here's the thing about moments like that. When they happen on a debate stage, they don't just damage the person being attacked. They reveal something deeper, a crack in the foundation that was already there. Mamdani's collapse wasn't just about one lie or one bad debate performance. It was about what he represented, a wing of the Democratic Party that has become so ideologically driven so detached from practical concerns that even liberal voters are starting to have second thoughts. And that brings us to what Andrew Cuomo called the quiet civil war happening inside the Democratic Party right now. It's not on the front pages every day, but it's real and it's intensifying. On one side, you have the progressive, democratic socialist wing, people like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and yes, Zoran Mamdani. They want to fundamentally transform American society, embrace policies that sound more like European social democracies, and push cultural positions that prioritize identity politics above almost everything else. On the other side, you have the establishment, corporate Democrats, people like Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and frankly, Andrew Cuomo himself. They're more pragmatic, more willing to compromise, and generally more focused on winning elections than on ideological purity. For a while, these two factions coexisted relatively peacefully. The establishment tolerated the progressives, figured they were energizing young voters, and assumed they could keep them in line when it mattered. But that assumption is breaking down. Here's a data point that should terrify establishment Democrats. Recent polling from NBC shows that roughly 2/3 of Democratic voters now view socialism favorably. 2/3. That's not a fringe position anymore, it's becoming the mainstream view within the party. But here's the problem. When you look at independent voters, only about a quarter of them share that view. Among Republicans, it's somewhere around 10 to 15%. So you have a situation where the Democratic base is moving dramatically to the left on economic issues, while the broader electorate, the people you need to win general elections, isn't following. It's like designing a rocket where the boosters are firing in one direction, but the guidance system is trying to steer in another. Eventually, something has to give. And in New York, something is giving. The latest polls show that Mamdani's once commanding lead, that 15 to 25-point advantage, has been cut in half. Among Hispanic voters, where he was ahead by somewhere around 30 points, Cuomo has closed the gap to nearly even. Among independents, Cuomo is now ahead by about 10 points. That's a massive shift in a very short period of time. And it's not happening in a vacuum, because while this is playing out in New York, an entirely different kind of implosion was happening in Washington, the government shutdown. And the parallels are striking. For those of you who might not have been following every detail, here's the essential story. Congress needed to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government funded. Republicans, who control both the House and the Senate, put forward what they called a clean bill, basically temporary funding without a lot of controversial add-ons. Democrats in the Senate refused to vote for it. They insisted on including provisions that would restore certain Medicaid funding, extend Affordable Care Act premium subsidies, and most controversially provide benefits for undocumented immigrants. The total cost of what they wanted added was somewhere in the range of $1 to $2 trillion. Now, you might have your own views on whether those policies are good or bad. But here's what's politically significant. Republicans framed the entire shutdown as Democrats choosing to help non-citizens over American citizens. And that message, fair or not, landed. Because here's what started happening. Groups that have historically been some of the most loyal supporters of Democrats began publicly turning against them. The American Federation of Government Employees, a union representing somewhere between 750,000 and 850,000 federal workers, put out a statement demanding that Democrats pass the clean, continuing resolution and end the shutdown immediately. No conditions, no negotiations, just end it. Think about that. A union that had endorsed Joe Biden, that had campaigned for Democratic candidates, was now publicly siding with Republicans and Trump. That's not supposed to happen. But it didn't stop there. The American Bankers Association, which represents roughly 90 to 95% of U.S. banks, issued a nearly identical statement. Then America's credit unions followed suit. Then the Independent Community Bankers of America warned that the shutdown was threatening economic growth and Main Street businesses. These aren't fringe groups. These aren't radical organizations. These are establishment institutions that normally try to stay out of partisan battles. And they were all saying the same thing. Democrats, you need to give in. Now, Why does that matter? Because it signals something that political insiders watch very carefully when institutional players start hedging. It means they sense which way the wind is blowing. It's like when you're building a company and your early investors start getting nervous. They don't pull out all at once. First, they stop returning calls as quickly. Then they start asking harder questions. Then they quietly start looking for exit strategies. By the time they're publicly expressing concerns, the game is usually already over. That's what was happening here. Longtime Democratic allies were publicly distancing themselves, which sent a signal to everyone else. This strategy isn't working. And then, something even more remarkable happened. The media started breaking ranks. Now, if you've watched cable news over the past several years, you know that outlets like CNN and MSNBC have generally been very friendly to Democratic positions. They might criticize individual Democrats, but the overall narrative tends to align with party messaging. But during this shutdown, something shifted. CNN's Jake Tapper had an interview with Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury from New Mexico, and it was brutal. Tapper kept pressing her, "Why don't you just ask your Democratic senators to vote to open the government so SNAP benefits aren't at risk?" SNAP, for those who might not be familiar, is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, basically food stamps. The shutdown was threatening to delay those payments, which would hurt a lot of vulnerable families. Stansbury kept trying to deflect, kept trying to blame the White House, kept trying to change the subject, but Tapper wouldn't let her. You didn't see interviews like that a month earlier. You certainly didn't see them during the previous administration. And that's significant because when even friendly media outlets start asking uncomfortable questions, it means the narrative has shifted. It means the political current is flowing in a different direction, and people who depend on reading that current, journalists, analysts, institutional leaders, are adjusting accordingly. So let's talk about what the numbers actually show, because this is where it gets really interesting. You would think that a government shutdown, especially one happening while Republicans control both chambers of Congress, would hurt Republicans politically, right? That's certainly what Democrats were counting on. That's what the historical pattern suggested might happen. But that's not what happened. Polling data from CNN, again, not exactly a right-wing outlet, showed that Republican approval ratings actually went up during the shutdown. Not by a huge amount, somewhere in the range of 2 to 5 points, depending on the specific question, but up nonetheless. Meanwhile, Democratic numbers either stayed flat or declined slightly. Even more striking, the generic congressional ballot, which asks people whether they'd vote for a Democrat or Republican if the election were held today, showed Democrats in their worst position in roughly 2 decades when compared to other midterm cycles with a Republican president. At a similar point during Trump's first term, Democrats were ahead by somewhere around 10 to 12 points. Now, their lead had shrunk to about 3 points. Some polls showed it even closer. Think about what that means. In a political environment where you'd expect the opposition party to be riding high, where you'd expect anger at the party in power to be building, the opposite was happening. The party out of power was losing ground. So what explains that? How does a shutdown that's technically happening under Republican control end up hurting Democrats more than Republicans? The answer comes down to 2 things: strategy and narrative. Let's talk about Trump's approach first. Because whether you admire him or can't stand him, you have to acknowledge that his handling of this situation was masterful from a tactical standpoint. From the very beginning of the shutdown, Trump himself stayed mostly out of the direct negotiations. He didn't call Chuck Schumer. He didn't hold emergency meetings with Democratic leaders. Instead, he delegated day-to-day management to Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader John Thune. That might seem like he was being hands-off, but it was actually strategic positioning. By staying at a distance, he avoided becoming the face of the conflict. He didn't give Democrats a clear target to attack. But behind the scenes, he was doing something much more important. He was maintaining absolute unity among Republicans. And I mean absolute. There wasn't a single Republican in either chamber who broke ranks and voted with Democrats. Not one. If you know anything about herding cats, which is basically what managing a political party is like, you know how remarkable that is. Republicans are famous for infighting, for breaking into factions, for having members who go rogue at the worst possible times. But during this shutdown, they held together like a solid piece of steel. Now, how did Trump do that? By making the stakes crystal clear. He framed the entire shutdown around one simple, politically powerful message. Democrats are willing to shut down the government to send money to people who aren't even supposed to be in the country. Now, whether that's a completely fair characterization is debatable, but it was effective, because it put Democrats in a position where they had to defend a very unpopular stance, prioritizing spending on undocumented immigrants over keeping the government running for American citizens. And every day the shutdown continued, that message got reinforced. Every news story about delayed benefits, every interview with a frustrated federal worker, every statement from a business group, all of it fed into the same narrative. Democrats are holding Americans hostage for their ideological agenda. But Trump did something else that was really smart. He used the shutdown as an opportunity to reshape government operations in ways that would have been much harder to do with Congress fully functional. During a shutdown, constitutional authority for managing the government shifts more heavily to the executive branch, specifically to the Office of Management and Budget. And who runs the OMB? A guy named Russell Vought, who was the chief architect of Project 2025, that controversial blueprint for restructuring the administrative state that got so much attention during the campaign. So while Democrats were focused on trying to win the messaging war, Trump's people were quietly using their expanded authority to cancel or pause tens of billions of dollars in federal funding. The Department of Transportation alone paused somewhere between $15 and $20 billion in projects, including major infrastructure work in New York and other blue states. They claimed these projects violated civil rights laws because of DEI-based contracting requirements. Whether that legal theory holds up is something courts might eventually decide. But the practical effect was immediate billions of dollars that Democratic governors and mayors were counting on suddenly disappeared. And in Washington, the OMB used the shutdown to eliminate somewhere in the range of 4,000 to 5,000 federal positions. These weren't just layoffs due to lack of funding, these were permanent cuts to the federal workforce. From Trump's perspective, this was a win-win situation. The longer the shutdown lasted, the more he got to accomplish things he wanted to do anyway. He was getting paid to exercise, essentially. Meanwhile, Democrats were stuck in an impossible position. The longer they held out, the more political damage they took. But if they gave in, they'd look weak and would demoralize their progressive base. It's like being in a game of chicken where your opponent actually wants to crash. You can't win that game. And here's the thing about political strategy, it only works if the underlying psychology supports it. You can have the best messaging in the world, but if people don't believe you anymore, if your credibility is shot, then nothing you say will land. And that's really what we're seeing happen to Democrats right now. It's not just about this shutdown or Mamdani's campaign or any single event. It's about a broader collapse of moral authority. Think about it this way. For years, Democrats have positioned themselves as the party of honesty, of expertise, of trusting institutions and following the science and respecting the truth. They've spent enormous amounts of energy, particularly during and after the Trump administration, emphasizing that character matters, that truth matters, that you can't just make things up for political convenience. But then you have someone like Mamdani fabricating a story about September 11th for emotional effect. You have the administration making claims about the shutdown that don't quite match reality. You have progressive activists pushing narratives that fall apart under scrutiny. Each individual instance might seem small, but they accumulate, they compound, and eventually they erode the foundation of trust that makes persuasion possible. Because here's a truth about human psychology that any good engineer understands. Once a system loses integrity, you can't just patch it. You can pump in more energy, more resources, more effort, but if the fundamental structure is compromised, it's all just postponing the inevitable failure. That's what's happening with the Democratic brand right now among a lot of voters, particularly working class voters and independents. They're not seeing a party they can trust to tell them the truth. They're seeing a party that seems more interested in defending its ideological positions than in addressing their actual concerns. And that brings us to something deeper, something that Andrew Cuomo touched on and that Mamdani's campaign actually exemplifies. It's this concept of what we might call post-Americanism. Now, that might sound like abstract academic language, but it describes something very real that's happening in American politics. Traditionally, our political debates have been between left and right, liberal and conservative, Democrat and Republican. People disagreed about policy, about the size of government, about economic priorities, but there was generally a shared foundation, a belief that America itself, with all its flaws and problems, was fundamentally good and worth preserving. But increasingly, particularly on the progressive left, that foundation is crumbling. There's a growing sentiment that America as it has existed is fundamentally unjust, that its institutions are irredeemably corrupt, that its culture and traditions are rooted in oppression. So the debate isn't really left versus right anymore. It's becoming American versus post-American. It's between people who want to reform and improve the country we have and people who want to fundamentally reimagine it as something entirely different. And you can see this playing out in really concrete ways. Take immigration. The traditional debate was about how many immigrants we should accept and through what process. But now it's increasingly about whether American citizens should even be prioritized over non-citizens. Mamdani's campaign was built partly on this idea, so are the positions that led to the shutdown. Or take religion and culture. It's not just about separation of church and state anymore. It's about whether America's Christian heritage is something to be acknowledged and respected or something to be actively dismantled and replaced. You see this with Mamdani talking about mosques versus churches, about centering the Muslim experience of September 11th rather than the American national trauma. Again, you can have different views on those topics, but what's significant is the underlying framework, one that sees traditional American identity not as something to build on, but as something to overcome. Now, here's why this matters politically. For a while, this post-American wing of the progressive movement was successfully incorporated into the broader Democratic coalition. The establishment figures, your Schumers, your Pelosi's, they made their peace with it. They figured they could manage it, use its energy when helpful, and moderate it when necessary. But something's changing. The progressive wing is starting to assert independence. Mamdani hasn't endorsed the Democratic governor who endorsed him. Progressive members of Congress are increasingly willing to buck leadership. The Democratic Socialists of America are building their own organizational infrastructure. It's like watching a booster rocket separate from the main craft, except in this case, both pieces need each other to reach orbit, and they're separating too early. But here's where it gets really interesting, because this isn't just a Democratic problem. What we're actually witnessing is a much larger realignment that's happening across the entire political spectrum, not just in America but around the world. And it's being driven by the rise of populism. Now, populism has become kind of a dirty word in a lot of circles. Media elites use it as a synonym for dangerous demagoguery. But that's not quite right. Populism, at its core, is just the belief that ordinary people should have more control over the systems that affect their lives, and that entrenched elites have failed them. And you know what? On that basic level, populism is winning because it's correct. Think about the last 25 years. We had a financial crisis caused by reckless banking practices, and the bankers got bailed out while regular people lost their homes. We had endless wars in the Middle East that accomplished nothing except destabilizing the region and costing trillions of dollars and thousands of lives. We had trade deals that were supposed to create prosperity but instead hollowed out manufacturing communities. We had immigration policies that were supposed to be temporary but became permanent, changing communities without their consent. We had public health officials who were supposed to be above politics but turned out to be just as compromised as anyone else. Over and over, the establishment promised things would work, and they didn't. Over and over, experts insisted they knew best, and they were wrong. Over and over, institutions claimed authority they hadn't earned and couldn't maintain. So, of course people are populist now. Of course they don't trust the establishment. Of course they're attracted to politicians and movements that promise to upend the system rather than manage it. And this is happening everywhere. Look at Europe. Populist parties are surging in France, in Germany, in Italy, in the Netherlands. Look at Latin America, where countries are swinging wildly between left-wing and right-wing populists. Even in Asia, you're seeing establishment parties face unprecedented challenges. The pattern is global, and it's accelerating. But here's the critical distinction, and this is where Mamdani's implosion becomes really instructive. There are two kinds of populism competing right now: left populism and right populism. And they're not equally successful. Left populism, the Bernie Sanders, AOC, Mamdani version, is primarily economic. It's about wealth inequality, about making corporations pay their fair share, about expanding social programs, and those are legitimate concerns that resonate with people. But left populism has a fatal flaw. It's still deeply tied to woke cultural politics. It still prioritizes identity over commonality. It still alienates people by telling them they're oppressors because of characteristics they can't change. It still frames America itself as fundamentally problematic. So you end up with movements that promise economic justice but deliver cultural lecture and national self-loathing. And that's a really hard sell, even in deep blue areas like New York. Right populism, on the other hand, the Trump version, the version you're seeing succeed in Europe, does something different. It pivots left on economics while pivoting right on culture. So you get pro-union stances. You get skepticism toward free trade. You get willingness to use government power to protect workers and communities. Those are traditionally left-wing economic positions, and Trump has adopted a lot of them. But you also get defense of national identity. You get protection of borders. You get celebration of traditional culture and values. You get prioritization of citizens over non-citizens. And that combination, economically populist but culturally traditional, turns out to be really, really appealing to a lot of voters. It's appealing to working class people who feel like the economy is rigged against them, but who also don't want to be told their country and culture are evil. Even Bernie Sanders had to admit, and this must have pained him, that Trump has implemented more of his economic agenda than Democrats have. The pro-union positions, the tariffs to protect American manufacturing, the skepticism toward corporate power. Trump did it, Democrats talked about it. So when you combine that with cultural positions that most Americans actually agree with, that borders should mean something, that citizenship should matter, that America is worth defending, you get a very powerful political formula. And that's why right populism keeps beating left populism, even though they're both insurgent movements rebelling against the same failed establishment. Look at what happened in the shutdown. Republicans gained support, Democrats lost it. Look at what's happening in New York. Mamdani's lead evaporated when voters really started paying attention to what he represents. This isn't because of brilliant consulting or better advertising. It's because one side is offering a vision that matches how most people actually see the world, and the other side is demanding they see it differently. So where does all of this leave us? What does it mean for the future? I think what we're watching isn't just the collapse of a campaign or the end of a shutdown. We're watching a fundamental realignment of American politics, the kind of shift that happens maybe once or twice in a century. The old categories don't work anymore. Democrat versus Republican, left versus right. These labels are becoming less and less useful for understanding what's actually happening. The new divide is between people who believe in the system as it exists and people who think it's broken beyond repair. It's between those who trust institutions and those who want to rebuild them. It's between Americans who see continuity with the past as something to preserve and those who see it as something to escape. And within that divide, populism, particularly right-leaning populism that combines economic concern for working people with cultural defense of national identity, is emerging as the dominant force. Does that mean Democrats are doomed? Not necessarily, but it means they can't keep doing what they've been doing. They can't keep letting their most ideological wing drive the party toward positions that alienate half the country. They can't keep prioritizing symbolic gestures over practical results. They can't keep telling working class people that their concerns are less important than abstract principles. The shutdown is ending, it has to, because Democrats simply can't sustain the political damage. Mamdani will probably still win in New York because it's such a blue city, though his margin will be much smaller than expected. But these aren't victories for the Democratic establishment. They're warnings. What you're seeing is a political system under enormous stress, with cracks spreading in every direction. And just like with a rocket, under too much pressure, something eventually has to give. The question is whether what comes next is a controlled correction or a catastrophic failure, whether it's a necessary adjustment that makes the system stronger, or a collapse that breaks it entirely. And that, honestly, is up to all of us. It's up to whether we're paying attention, whether we're asking real questions instead of accepting comfortable narratives, whether we're willing to challenge failed institutions and demand something better, because the establishment, both Democrat and Republican versions, is not going to reform itself. It never does. Change happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough and force it to happen. That's what populism really means. Not mob rule or demagoguery, but people taking back agency over their own lives and communities. And like any powerful force, it can be used constructively or destructively. It can build or it can burn. The coming years are going to determine which way it goes. So if you've watched this far, it means you're paying attention, and that already puts you ahead of the curve. Don't just scroll past history as it's being written. Like this video if you believe truth still matters. Subscribe to stay part of a community that asks real questions. And leave a comment below, do you think this collapse is the end of the old system or the beginning of something better? Because one thing's for sure, America's next chapter is being written right now. The rocket is under maximum stress, the boosters are separating, and we're either about to achieve orbit or come crashing back down to Earth. And it's going to be unbelievable.